And then finally, distribution, which is perhaps the most obvious, but in some ways, technology and partnerships have radically transformed how the Post gets its journalism into the hands of the people who might be interested. So, a little bit of background. I would argue that between 2005 and 2014, there was an intense competition going on. And the competition was between what I would call buzzy and serious publishers. So serious publishers are titles that you would know and recognize, like the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian and the Telegraph and so on. And the buzzy new entrants to the market were often companies like BuzzFeed and Vox and Vice and Mike.com. And it really was a competition. It was a question of who would win. Would it be these new entrants, these digital-only competitors, versus the legacy competitors? But by 2015, the rules had changed. And what happened is it was no longer buzzy versus serious. It was can you be buzzy and serious. And by what I mean is that places like the Washington Post, we invested very heavily in audience teams. And we started paying more attention to what kinds of content was consumed on social platforms. And we were able to fairly massively grow our audience, even though we were staying true to our brand. And at the same time, some of those buzzy players like Vox and Vice, Vox sent reporters to Syria to cover the civil war, and BuzzFeed decided to build a whole new newsroom that was devoted to investigative journalism and serious news. And so suddenly the competition wasn't will one approach or the other win, but who could eclipse the other faster. So the bad news is that in the first 6 weeks of this year alone, 2,100 journalists lost their jobs. And so unfortunately, the message is that neither of those approaches really worked, that you couldn't be buzzy and serious necessarily and have that alone be the successful way to go. That, among other things, you needed to think very differently about what it means to be a storyteller, about what kinds of stories you tell, and how you get those stories into the hands of the audience when you need them. At the same time, the Post was able to grow its newsroom pretty dramatically. We went, over that same period, from about 550 people in the newsroom to about 900. So what I want to think about and talk about is where did that growth come from? What did we do with that growth that worked for us? And how can that growth hopefully help you, the lessons of it? So one thing that happened is that traffic from platforms decreased dramatically, at least for journalism. I don't know if you saw the same thing, but traffic, especially from Facebook, for us over that period dropped seriously. We saw about a 25% reduction in how much of WashingtonPost.com's traffic came from Facebook. At the same time, the world changed in some ways that were very good for the Post. I don't know how many of you subscribe to some sort of online video streaming product. Netflix, Hulu, HBO, something else, right? Almost all of us. So it's not just the serious digital news producers who were able to suddenly start getting people to subscribe, but rather that instead of this sort of attention-based economy, it moved to a more of a subscription-based economy. If you look, for example, at the numbers for Spotify, 4 years ago, they had about 20 million paid premium subscribers. Today, they have about 100 million. Netflix had about 50 million paid digital subscribers. Today, they have about 150 million. We don't release our exact subscription figures, but the curve, well, not the top line number, the curve is very similar for us. That we saw this explosion in people who were suddenly willing to pay for journalism. So why was that? Why were people suddenly willing to pay? In many ways, I would argue that the secret for what made it work for us is very similar to what Spotify and Netflix do, which is that in 2019, instead of being about buzzy and serious, instead, we're about critical and fascinating. And that this distinction, this other way to think about it, not just how is the news perceived, but what is involved in creating the news is everything that matters. So if we look at that as a matrix, we would say that critical news for us is opposite obligatory storytelling. And that fascinating storytelling is opposite meh storytelling. And what I mean by that is that obligatory storytelling are those stories that you feel obligated to do. I don't know how many of you are in PR, but I would say about half the press releases I read fall into that category. We have to tell you who our new chief officer is. We have to tell you about our new product launch. We don't have a particular story to tell other than it is a thing we have to do. In journalism, this might be the coverage of a meeting. You know, something happens in your city or your town or your state, and we say, okay, well, it happened, and then what? We did it because we sort of had to do it. On the other hand, mass storytelling, it might be a good story, but it's probably not told particularly well. And by that, I mean we haven't found the thing that makes people care. We haven't told it in the way that makes it interesting enough that you want to be there. And we spend almost all of our time trying to avoid this quadrant. It makes total sense. Of course, you don't want your stories to be in here. On the other hand, how do you get stories that are critical and fascinating, ideally? How do you get the stories that are hitting both of those key attributes? So for us, critical and fascinating stories break down in two other ways. They tend to be either live stories or in-depth stories. So a live story is a story of the moment. You know this intimately. The story that cable news breaks in with the red crawl and says, this is happening right now. And those kinds of stories are very important for us. I think they'd be important for you too. When your brand is involved in a breaking news story, you need to have a part of that conversation. In-depth storytelling is the exact opposite. It's storytelling where the timing is not really the driving factor. Instead, you have to have some information that is so compelling, so engaging, that potentially no one else has it, or no one else has it and is telling it in the way you are telling it. So let's look at some examples of that. So one example from the States, Supreme Court confirmations. One of our reporters had met with a woman who accused one of the, at the time, a potential Supreme Court justice, now current Supreme Court justice, of sexual assault. And she spoke to our reporter about 9 months before these hearings. And over the course of 3 months of ongoing conversation, they talked about whether or not she should tell her story publicly. What would be in it for her? What would be in it for the public? And they formed a bond, the reporter and the source. And by the time that this hearing was held, and this hearing was watched by tens of millions of people live, so it is simultaneously both a live and an in-depth story, the Post not only had an exclusive story from the accuser, but the Post itself was mentioned 33 times in the live hearing. Whether or not that's the kind of owned media your organization is looking for us, it says we are not just telling the story, we are part of the story. Because our coverage is so essential that you can't discuss the issues without discussing what we're doing. And when we're doing that, we know that our storytelling is effective. It's in that critical and fascinating category. Similarly, if you have a gift like the current American president, you can't help but tell both live and in-depth stories. But can you do it in a way that's really critical and fascinating and, most importantly, fair? So, for example, there have been more than 100 criminal counts. There have been 85 federal judges appointed, which has completely remade the American judiciary, and 37 administrators have either quit, been fired, or withdrew. So how are we telling the story? Well, we're telling the story in both ways. Just this morning, we broke news about the president's tax returns, about the American tax agency saying, initially anyway, that he had no right to hide them, despite what the president said. But we're also continuously adding those live elements. So we're trying to participate on both ends. We're trying to gather information that other people don't have, but also react to the constant stream of information that comes out of the American White House. And sometimes we're telling stories that until we start telling them, no one is talking about. So in the US, fentanyl, the synthetic opioid, which mostly comes from China and North Korea, is an absolute epidemic, but an epidemic that almost no one was paying attention to until recently. So for about 16 months, we worked on a 5-part series examining what's happening in the United States. And this is just the first episode in the 5-part series. But among other things, what you'll see is it's a really mixed media presentation, where we're combining video, informational graphics, still photos, all together in a way that is meant to drive deeper engagement. Because one of the things that we have learned is that the more deep and engaging our storytelling, the more likely the people viewing it are to subscribe. So for example, a typical story from the Post has about 90 seconds of engaged reading time. A story like this has somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes of engaged reading time. In fact, we often see users who start reading this during the day, presumably at work, and then finish it up at night if the story is long enough and compelling enough. And when we have those moments, we try to capitalize on them. I don't know if you noticed, but inside this story, we actually had a newsletter sign up, not to get some generic newsletter, but to be notified every time one of these stories happens. And so we're constantly trying to think, how can we tell the stories? How can the visual presentation of the stories actually drive people to deeper engagement? Sometimes you don't even need a lot of text to tell the story. So this is part of a climate change series we've done called Gone in a Generation. And this is all about what is happening in the Arctic Circle. In areas like this, it used to be completely solid ice. Now it's a rushing river. You can see how quickly the glacial melt is going on. There are cities that are being built on this land, well, that used to be just ice. And we thought about lots of ways we could tell the story, but we ended up telling it as a visual essay. It's almost completely just still photography and video, because we knew that we wanted to tell the climate change story, but lots of people have written about the impact of climate change. We wanted it to be visceral. You had to feel the impact of these changes. And by telling a story that was so visually driven, we got the kind of engagement that we wanted. The other thing that we are doing a lot of is experimenting with platforms. So how can we use new technologies to help tell stories in these deep and engaging ways, these critical and fascinating types of stories? I wish I could say that every time we experimented, we were successful. So I want to sort of show you what experimentation looks like at the Post and when it works and when it doesn't work. So for example, in augmented reality, we told our first AR story in 2015. It was about the Freddie Gray trial. It's a civil rights issue in the United States. The second story we did, it took us 2 more years after our bruising first story. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a second, to do our second story. It was, for the first time, markerless AR, which I'll talk about in a second, and that was all about architecture. We told our third AR story in February of 2018. You can see some gaps here as we kind of tried to regroup from maybe less than successful launches. And it was all about the Winter Olympics. Then we told our first web-based AR story in September of 2018. And then finally, we told an AR Apple News story in November of 2018. So let me walk you through those now that you have a sense of the timeline and tell you what worked and what didn't. So this Freddie Gray story, we were really excited. We believed that we were one of the first news publishers in the world to tell an AR story. Unfortunately, due to the technology at the time, you had to download a new app, and you had to point that app at a marker, printed or on another device. So essentially, for our digital consumers, I asked them to get out their phones, point them at a laptop or a tablet, and I don't know if you can guess, but you can imagine how many people actually did that. Almost none. It was so painful that it was almost a full year later until we tried our next experiment. This time, we learned some lessons, and what we did is both markerless, meaning you didn't have to point the device at anything, and we baked it into our native app. And we have a couple 100,000 people who come and use the native app every day. This is one of the big reasons that for us, augmented reality is about our existing audience, because it's very hard to drive app downloads, but the people who do download your app are very likely to use it. This story was much more successful. We did a couple of clever things that really worked for us. We baked AR aggressively into the navigation, so you almost couldn't miss it when you opened the app. And then we promoted it even within the app fairly heavily. That worked pretty well, but we didn't have the kinds of deep engagement we wanted. So the next try we did was with the Winter Olympics. And this actually was a game. There was some interaction to what we did. So you could point your device at a table or a flat space, and then you could try to guess which of the Winter Olympic athletes in which sport are the fastest, and then we would race. So this had pretty good engagement, but the challenge is it's still very much locked into our mobile app, reaching the existing audience we have. So then in September of 2018, Apple announced that it was going to do web-based AR. Have you used the web-based AR in iOS Safari? So you can, just scrolling through the story, hit the AR marker, place the AR experience in your space, and consume it. So we immediately, within I think the first 4 days, launched this app. The Smithsonian American Museums had a dinosaur skeleton. They didn't know whether it was a Triceratops or not, and we allowed you to place it in the space and then explained why it turns out it is a Triceratops, what the distinguishing features are. Comparatively, we went from, in the Winter Olympics experience, about 30 or 40,000 people consuming it, to this one having about 80 or 90,000 people, because the web was so much more accessible. It was still in the native app, but it was also web-based. Then, by November, in the US in November, as part of our weird Thanksgiving tradition, we carve turkeys. It's about the only time people in the US ever do it, and so one of the major Google searches in the month of November that ever takes anyone to the Washington Post is, how do I carve my turkey? I don't know why, but that's a thing. And so what we did is we used photogrammetry. Have any of you done this where you take a physical object, you photograph it a couple thousand times, and then you build essentially a 3D mesh of that object, and then you layer little polygons from the photos that you've taken to make the 3D object. And so we cooked 5 turkeys in different stages of the process, did photogrammetry on each of them, and then showed you with digital knives how you would carve different pieces. Here's how you cut the breast off, here's how you cut the wings. This story did almost 500,000 visits. It did it through a combination of appearance in Apple News, which drove a lot of traffic, mobile Safari, which also drove a fair amount of traffic, and then our loyal users who encountered it in our Classic app. It's not that we have AR completely figured out, but if we go back to the beginning where I was pretty sad that we had less than 2,000 people look at that Freddie Gray example in 2015 to 500,000 people in 2019 or 2018, we're starting to really get to a point where AR is tipping into the norm in our newsroom. And the way that I work at the Post is that as we approach that tipping point, I hand off these kinds of experiments to the rest of the newsroom. So today, our graphics team does a lot of our AR-based storytelling because it is now a normal part of the storytelling that we do. Another example of how these techniques become commonplace is that about 4 years ago, we had no trained drone operators. Today, we have about a dozen. One of the things that we do with our drones is videogrammetry. Videogrammetry, like photogrammetry, means flying our drone or using multiple video cameras to capture someone and then creating a 3D video object. And so what we did here is Bears Ears National Park, which is in Utah, so out west in the United States. The dimensions of the park are changing. That part of it's highly political. And what we've done is we flew a drone around parts of the park, and we actually turned some of the rock formations into video objects. Once inside the video object, we're controlling in a linear way the scrolling, although we can also allow the users to change their perspective. And what we try to do, again, in these types of stories using this technology is to make these really multi-sensory stories, where you do a combination of reading, sometimes watching, sometimes listening, and always engaging with different story formats as you move through the story. Again, when we use these multidisciplinary approaches and these multi-sensory consumption experiences, what we see is that people engage much more deeply. They spend more time, but they also are more likely to share the story. They're more likely to come back to the story, and they're especially more likely to be subscribers. And so for us, with that as our goal, we can definitively see how, when we use these different types of storytelling techniques, we actually have a return on some key metrics that matter to us. And all of this is made possible because we build the tools that we use for storytelling. This is one of the things that has most dramatically changed about the way that the Post works. So starting about 7 years ago, we started building what is now a suite of publishing tools that we call ARC. And this one, for example, is called WebSched, and it's almost a Twitter-like feed of every story we produce. We produce about 400 editorial stories a day. You can see all of them in all states. You can drop in and see how far someone is in a particular project. You can see what the editing looks like. But it is the fact that we are building these tools ourselves that allows us to make the tools in the ways that we need. Among other things, one of the tough transitions for us is when we were primarily a newspaper, we were often staffing our best designers and sub-editors, we'd call them copy editors, at night, because that's when the paper needed it. But our biggest audience is in the morning. And so as we can measure more accurately when things are publishing, we're actually able to shift our staffing in the ways that we need to tell stories better. The other thing that we're doing a lot of with data is we're doing a better job measuring. There's nothing wrong with page views per se, but page views alone weren't enough of a way for us to know when our journalism was successful. So we created what we call Spectrum, which is a combined metric. It has a combination of propensity to subscribe, social sharing, recirculation, if you go to one story, you go to another one, time spent, and page views. And what you see is each of the colors represents a different type of journalism that we do. So political journalism, entertainment, sport, business. And you'll see there's a really big mix. We tend to look at it like a bell curve where we pay attention to the ends. What is happening with these stories that are unsuccessful, and what is happening with those stories that are most successful? How can we take those lessons and apply them to all the stories that are in the middle? The other thing that we do with data is that we're really passionate about the use of artificial intelligence, not to try to replace our reporters and editors, but to augment them. So we talk a lot about how can AI be a complementary tool that helps not just our audience, but helps our journalists too. So we tend to talk about AI in the same three buckets that I said that I do most of my projects in. How does AI help us with creation? How does it help us with consumption? And how does it work with distribution? So creation is often about things like, how do we find stories? So our reporters will tell us, oh, I watch these two sets of numbers all the time. And when one moves this way and one moves that way, then I know I need to do a story. Well, the AI system should watch those numbers for you. It should find these aberrations or these patterns in data that might be worth reporting on. It helps us do things like audio transcription. It even helps us know whether we're quoting the same people over and over and over again. On the consumption side, and I'll talk a lot more about this in a second, we can actually generate stories. It's one of the most powerful things that we're doing, but we can also customize and personalize the stories based on your interests and aptitude. And then finally, on distribution, we do a ton of multivariate testing. We test different headline and photo combinations. We test different ways we can present the story. And in real time, we make updates to the story based on that. We add in related links based on what the machine thinks is most valuable for your storytelling. And we even moderate some of the comments on our stories using AI. So especially around story generation, how does this work? So what you see here is a story that is completely written by machine. So in the US elections for the last 2 cycles, we have actually covered 500 plus races, all with an AI system. And so what we do is we set the machine to look at certain patterns of data about campaign finance donations, data about election counting, and then we write what we call living stories. So a living story is a story that starts out at the beginning in the US elections in the primary season, where we determine which people will represent which parties. And then the stories continue to evolve over time up and through that first election night. And then we determine who's going to win, and then the stories keep at the same URL changing. This is really important because Google over time comes to believe that we are the source for information on this election because we have the same URL that's constantly updated as we have new information. And the readers are very able to go and find stories that they care about their districts because they're always in the same place. We even use geolocation to say this is a story we think you should care about based on where you are. And so the system, which we call Heliograph, has an observer, a detector, and a writer. And basically what it does is it looks for data, it determines which numbers it needs out of that data, it writes stories for a variety of platforms, and then it pushes it out everywhere. So we're not just writing a story for our website, but we can write Facebook posts, we can write tweets, we can send things to Facebook Messenger or the Amazon Echo. The idea is once the system can write a story, it can write a story anywhere instantly. And so what does this look like? Well, each sentence is just a series of variables. So it's actually not as complicated as you think. You have these if-then statements. So which direction has the turnout in the race gone? Are the votes up or are the votes down? And then we use branching logic to say which sentence should we show in which order, or if at all. And so the stories end up being fairly different from each other, all powered by the system. And what this looks like in real time is that we publish a primary preview, and then there are different types of primaries, and the system just knows which type of primary each race is. And then they look at the outcome of those races. Did it finish? Is it going to a runoff? Is it still in progress? And then it goes to the runoff, and then it becomes a general story. And so this all happens automatically. After we initially set up the story, the machine does everything else. And so on election night, we can even use the machine to do live analysis. So this is an example where we were listening for specific turnout in specific parts of specific states, and then the machine would tell our human editor what it was doing in terms of analysis, and then the editor is manually choosing what goes live. And so what we end up with is something that looks very much like a WhatsApp group or a group conversation of some kind, where we have analysis generated by machine, selected by human, and appearing to the end user as if it's just all part of the regular Washington Post output. So this is Pulitzer Prize Day when they announced the best journalism of the year. And what I would say for the Post is this combination of new technologies plus excellence in storytelling is absolutely critical. And that together, it is this combination of technology and storytelling that allows us to be both critical and fascinating. And to me, if you can embody those two attributes as a storyteller, then you're absolutely doing the right thing. Thank you very much. I think I might have time for a question or two. Unless there aren't, in which case you're letting me off easy.
of course.
Go ahead.
Yep, we have a question, so let me run.
Hi there. Have you noticed a different attitude to technology since Mr. Bezos took over?
Could you, I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
So have you noticed that there's perhaps an increased appetite for technology since Mr. Bezos took over?
It's absolutely true that since Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post in October of 2013, there has been much more of an emphasis on technology throughout the company. That's two reasons. One, he cares about technology, there is no doubt. But two, frankly, we couldn't really afford to invest in our own technology. So just as the newsroom grew pretty dramatically, when I started at the Post shortly after Bezos bought it, we had about 125 engineers. Today we have about 300 engineers working on building these tools. That is absolutely critical. Without that, our current technology team could barely keep things running. But now we can build technology that other people, both news organizations and brands, are willing to license. So it's very dramatically changed.
Perfect. We have another question here.
Oh.
Hi. What's your traffic acquisition model? And so what's the split of your referral?
Traffic acquisition model and
referral.
Oh, referral. So one of the things that has changed a lot over time is where the source of our traffic comes from. So initially, when Bezos bought the Post did about 25 million domestic unique visitors and 4 or 5 million international ones. Today, we do between 85 and 95 million domestic unique visitors and about 25 to 30 million internationals. But even over that time period, it's changed a lot. So at the beginning, at one point, Facebook was 32% of our overall traffic in terms of referrals, which is enormous. Today, Apple News is about 25% of that number. So Facebook has fallen from 32% to, I think, 8%. Google Search is up dramatically these days. I think as people have tried to find real sources of real news, people have been searching more aggressively. They've been choosing brands both by going directly to our site and to our apps, but also in Apple News where they could say, I know the source of this information. But that's the makeup today is mostly driven externally by Google Search and Apple News. Was there one more question?
Yes, the last question.
Hi, great talk, thank you. It's really interesting to hear how the newsroom's changing from kind of old-fashioned journalists of store words and pictures into data visualization and engineers and that growth in the newsroom. I'm curious to hear a little bit about the revenue side of that equation. Sure. Have your revenues grown to keep pace with that new talent and the, I guess, increasing costs?
We are a private company, so there are some limited things that I can share that are things that have been out in the public. So about 3 years ago, we were profitable for the first time in a long, long time. That is driven by a couple of things. One, we have been able to manage the decline in print, both advertising and circulation. So still a declining story, but not as bad as it could be. On the other hand, our digital revenues, both from advertising and digital subscriptions, have taken off. That when Bezos bought the Post, there was effectively no digital subscription business, and today that is a huge driver of revenue. But in addition to those two things, we started doing a lot more with live events, which has been fairly profitable and successful, but then also licensing our technology platform, licensing the ARC platform, is a real meaningful driver of revenue now. So the combination of all of those factors, yes, the Post is in much better financial shape than we were then. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Let's give him a hand.